Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, I'm just really thrilled because I have a conversation coming up with Constanti Gebert, whom I have known for ages, but not real well. We were both involved in the Helsinki Citizens Assembly back in the 80s, maybe a little bit in the 90s. And he has a wonderful history. So he's such an interesting man. I'm looking forward to this. He was during the period when Poland was trying to decommunize. He was very engaged with that movement, and he was one of the people who started this thing called the Flying University. And now I think he's become a war correspondent. It was sort of a war at the time, and he's so Jewish. As I understand it, he didn't know that he was Jewish when he was brought up. People sometimes decided not to display that. So when he found out he was Jewish, he became really enthusiastic. So he is more Jewish than the Pope. Good morning. How are you, Constanti?
Good to see you again.
Yeah, it has been 25 years maybe. Last time I saw you, you came to Toronto and I was going to give you a ride and show you the city. And I couldn't find your address, and it was a rainy day and the traffic was awful. And so I've decided I have to be extra nice to you to make up for it today. So let's cover 25 years of history now. Tell me what you've been doing with yourself. I heard one dramatic event that you have decided to discipline Gazeta Wyborcza by withdrawing your services for a time. Is that the story?
Well, that's a minor incident. It's personally painful because I've been with the paper from day one, ever since we merged from the underground in '89 and became legal. But we had a disagreement about whether an Ukrainian military formation can be described as neo-Nazi or not. And if you can't agree on fundamentals, it's difficult to work together. So we had a parting of the ways.
Well, that's a big story, because I always identified you so much with that newspaper, which was such a wonderful newspaper in the day. Maybe it still is a wonderful newspaper, but I don't know where to go to cover our history. Maybe we'd better back up to the end of the Cold War and the time when I think we probably met in Istanbul, when maybe one of the last, it wasn't quite the last meeting of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, but it was a big one and a very good one. And I haven't been to it since, and it doesn't exist really as such. But so that's about the time when maybe you need to help me get caught up with your various adventures.
I've been earning my living as a journalist. I've been, at that time, I had just finished covering the war in Bosnia. And from there, I went on to covering Rwanda and Afghanistan, and been working in different locations in the Middle East. At the same time, working in Poland and helping rebuild Jewish life after the end of communism, and also being involved in Polish social life, which had re-emerged from the underground the way we did. In the 80s, I was working as an underground journalist when Poland was under martial law. So all that, not to mention 4 kids and a number of cats, kept quite busy.
All right.
And there we are.
There we are, as if, now we're caught up. Now, okay, now let's fill in some of the blanks. you covered something in Rwanda. Well, now that was the big massacre was before that, though. So you must have gone afterwards. Is that right?
Yes. I was looking at how you recover from a genocide, especially in a country that is totally devastated and pretty much left to its own resources. And that's an extraordinary story. Rwanda is an extraordinary story and not a very optimistic one, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of what had eventually led me to my latest book. I've published a dozen books till now, and the latest one is called Final Solutions, and it is a comparative analysis of genocide in the 20th and 21st century.
Mm.
And Rwanda is, of course, part of that analysis.
Mm.
I had a kind of feeling I owe this to my mother, who was, she escaped Warsaw when the Germans came in 1939 and returned as a soldier of the Polish army in the East, the Polish army set up by the communists. Having spent 2.5 years, gun in hand, fighting for my right to be born. I was born after that, but had mother lost the war, we wouldn't be talking.
Mm.
So from her in 45 to me looking at Rwanda after 95, there's a continuity. And I wanted to try to understand where does that continuity come from, and where does it lead us?
Okay. Indeed. Well, in fact, what I've heard such mixed reports about Rwanda. You know,
Mhm.
I hear glowing things about. I'm sorry, I'm 90 now, and my memory of names is very feeble.
Paul Kagame, the president.
Kagame, good.
Yeah.
And you know, people say great things about him, but other people say, So, and I know a man who had to escape from Rwanda with. There was real repression. He was really in trouble. So there must be real concerns, not just when you were there, but even today. Can you, I suppose you keep in touch and you know what's going on. Tell me your analysis of what, or your opinion about the politics in Rwanda and the prospect for ethnic harmony.
Well, it's very difficult to transform a country that has been devastated by genocide into a thriving and peaceful liberal democracy. Kagame was...
Germany did it.
Well, Germany had the good luck of being occupied by countries that in the West were desperate to make it a showcase of liberal democracy and invested a huge amount of effort and money into making that work, to prove that the alternative in the East Germany as occupied by the Soviet Union, that alternative is worse. No other country that lost the war had this kind of good luck. So Germany was extremely lucky in its choice of the nations that defeated it, so to say. Rwanda liberated itself. Nobody paid much attention to yet another African massacre. In fact, the genocide itself was not covered by the media because that was not the story in Africa in 94, right? The story in Africa in 94 was the end of apartheid and the democratic elections in South Africa. That's where literally thousands of journalists went. And some of the journalists who tried to convince their editors to send them to Rwanda heard, oh, but we already did Africa this year, okay? Haven't you seen the South African coverage? So 800,000 people were slaughtered in 2.5 months without this really being covered. And the victors, the Rwandan Patriotic Front under Paul Kagame, inherited a devastated country, no resources, certainly no democratic traditions to speak of. And also, they inherited a fundamental problem. You just said earlier, how do you function in a situation of ethnic conflict? But the conflict in Rwanda wasn't really ethnic. Rwanda, before the colonial times, was a very sophisticated and complicated society, divided roughly into two groups, the Tutsi and the Hutu, which played different social roles, but they both spoke the same language, shared the same tradition, the same culture, and it was possible to move between groups, you see. So although the kings of Rwanda were always Tutsis, the leaders of the different clans could be Tutsi or Hutu. It was more reminiscent of a feudal Europe, say, in its division between estates, right? The nobility, the peasants, eventually the bourgeoisie.
So there were in effect, class differences between the two groups. One was higher status than the other.
Occupational differences. The Hutu were rather farmers, the Tutsi were rather herders. But the point is, this had really nothing to do with the European vision of ethnicity.
Okay.
And it was a very sophisticated society with a standing army, a legal system. And when Rwanda was, quote unquote, discovered by a British adventurer in the second half of the 19th century, he was stunned to see a sophisticated country functioning in Africa and decided that this anomaly must be accounted for. So he invented a history for Rwanda. I'm not making this up, this actually happened. He decided that since there are some physical differences in the way that Tutsi and Hutu look, Tutsi are taller, more slender, sometimes more light-skinned. So he decided that Tutsis must be foreign invaders who had conquered Rwanda and looking, well, less black, halfway to white. They're obviously the superior race. And this is why Rwanda is such a sophisticated country. And he decided that the Tutsis really came from the Horn of Africa. They were Semites who conquered the barbaric Africans.
He made this up. Is that right?
It has absolutely nothing to do with reality, okay? But if you were Rwandan then, you wouldn't have even known it, because who knew what reports John Henning Specky, that was his name, sent to the Royal Society in London? Uh-huh. But when Rwanda became colonized, this became the dominant orthodoxy. When Rwanda was a Belgian colony in the 30s, the Belgians actually brought in teams of anthropologists to replace this African mess when you can be Tutsi and become a Hutu and become a Tutsi again. No, I mean, we have to have a serious scientific country. And they came up with a definition. They said, you are Tutsi if you are 1.85 meters or taller, or if you have 10 cows or more. If not, you're Hutu, but they brought in the concept of identity cards, and your identity card said once and for all that you're either Tutsi or Hutu.
Lord.
And the Tutsi were told that they are the master race. Now,
Oh my God.
who
I didn't
doesn't?
know any of this. I never heard this before. It's
Well,
horrible.
there you go. And therefore, they were privileged by the colonizer. They were better educated. They got the plum jobs, whatever. So obviously, when the Belgians eventually withdrew, there was a Hutu uprising against Tutsi rule. And ever since, Hutu were being told by their leadership that we need to organize, otherwise, the former master race will reconquer us. And if you wish, the Rwandan genocide of the 90s was provoked by a group of fundamentalist Hutu agitators who managed to convince society that we don't slaughter them all, they'll come back and rule over us once again. Now, the entire mental framework for the genocide was imported from Europe, okay? Without it, the genocide would not be conceivable, literally, would not have happened. And Rwanda is living.
Excuse me, but I'm connecting this. You keep referring to the Belgians, and it leaves me confused about the role of the Congo, the Belgian Leopold and so on, because he did these horrible things. Now that wasn't genocide at all, but it was unbelievably, the atrocities were amazing.
Well, that in fact is part of the problem, you see, because the Belgians obtained Rwanda after World War I. It was previously a German colony. They obtained it as compensation for having been occupied by the Germans. I love this idea of compensating one country with somebody else's country because a third country had occupied the first country, right? And the Belgians came in already with the experience of the Congo and actually with a guilty conscience, and they decided that this time they're going to do it right. In fact, Belgium put much more money into Rwanda that it ever extracted from it. And this was one of the reasons why they decided that they have an obligation to replace this unholy African mess with a genuine, rigorous, scientific system of racial division.
Oh my God.
And that's why they invested in studying what separates Tutsi and Hutu, and then supported the master race. And then, of course, the underclass had a rebellion. So this was the country that Kagame inherited. They did desperate efforts trying to rebuild it from scratch, but they did arrest over 100,000 people under the suspicion of participation in genocide. And in the overwhelming majority of the cases, the suspicion was probably extremely well-founded. Mm-hmm. This was a mass venture. Germany, which was highly industrialized, did its genocide in a technologically sophisticated, specialized way, and it didn't take more than 30,000 people to service the entire genocide, right? Rwanda, being an agricultural society, did it the way you cultivate the fields. You send out people into the fields to do the hard labor. Almost everybody was murdered by machete. Incidentally, it started with Rwanda importing over 500,000 machetes from China. And nobody thought to ask, well, excuse me, you need those machetes for what? And then they were used to slaughter people. One of the genocidaires, the perpetrators of the genocide, actually told me that it was very hard work because the human being is a large animal and it takes time to slaughter it. So anyway, you are the victorious Rwandan Patriotic Front. You have defeated the genocidaire. You put over 120,000 people in jail. How are you going to run the country? It's devastated, it's destroyed, and its labor force is in jail, right?
So mostly after the genocide, it was as if the Tutsi, was that really what they did? Sort of put the Tutsis back in power?
Largely,
Is
yes.
Kagame a Tutsi, or does it matter anymore?
It does. Kagame is Tutsi. He also looks very Tutsi, tall and thin and whatever. Well, the problem is that 3 million people fled Rwanda when the Rwandan Patriotic Front took over.
They mostly went to Congo, didn't they?
They went to Congo.
Uh-huh.
They were the previous establishment, all of them concerned that they might be put on trial for crimes. And therefore, the only educated people around were mainly Tutsi. And yes, the Tutsi took over. And this established itself without much violence in the beginning. Eventually, the exiles were allowed to return, and the prisoners suspected of genocide actually went through an extraordinary legal experience. You see, they couldn't be put on trial because the Tutsi lawyers were dead and the Hutu lawyers had fled. It was calculated that the average waiting time till you get your day in court is over 100 years, right? Which meant that the only solution was to return to a traditional Rwandan institution called the Gacaca. The Gacaca means the green meadow, and this is where the village would meet if there was an issue to be solved. Say there is accusation of cow theft or of stealing somebody's land. The village meets on the Gacaca. The accusers elect a prosecutor. The accused elect a defender. The village elects a court, and it has to be over by nightfall. Functions very well in cases of cow theft, possibly less so in cases of genocide. But what was the alternative? Keep 120,000 people in jail without charges? So they did go through the gachachas, which means that within 20 years, almost everybody accused of genocide was back home.
They acquitted them.
No, they were sentenced, but Rwanda abolished the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So they would be sentenced to 15, 20 years of jail and eventually go out.
Okay.
Now, this is not a big country. People encounter the people who have slaughtered their brothers, their fathers on the street, okay? And they have to continue functioning. Net result, there is no liberal democracy in Rwanda. Elections are a sham. The president recently got elected for the fourth or fifth time in office with 97% of the vote, with a 98% turnout. Mm-hmm. The weird thing is that it's almost certain that Kagame would win the elections if there would be a fair election. Mm-hmm. Because his administration is competent. Rwanda is the one African country where you don't have plastic bags flying around and hanging from trees. It's illegal to have plastic bags in Rwanda. They solved this problem. Rwanda is the country that has the most serious female participation in politics. Most of the parliament is female, and women play equal roles as men in a system that certainly is not democratic, but if you wish, is ecumenically undemocratic. It doesn't oppress women more than it oppresses men. And most Rwandans recognize that this is an incomparably better country than the one that Kagame inherited.
Mm.
But the one question you don't dare ask in Rwanda is, what happens if Kagame has a heart attack?
Oh,
Because nobody knows if all this can survive his death. Officially, it's illegal even to identify anybody as Tutsi or Hutu in public. We're all Rwandan.
mm.
But everybody knows. An old woman in a village once told me, you know, before there was a government that ordered all the Hutu to murder all the Tutsis. Now we have a government that ordered all the Tutsis to forgive all the Hutu. And you think that an ordinary person had anything to say about this then or now?
Talk about that as a general thing, because Rwanda is not the only place with that challenge, you know. I mean, I have friends, you know, in Bosnia or in Croatia who talk about going back to their village, and the people have to pass and deal with each other, knowing that, you know, they were killing each other, and they know who killed their brother and so on. I don't. I mean, the whole thing. How does anybody get past that? And has any society or even any individual got any insight into whether it's even possible? You know, I don't think that forgiveness is possible, really, toward anybody who refuses to acknowledge culpability and feel guilt. I don't believe anybody who says that they have forgiven. I think people deceive themselves and think they've forgiven. I just don't think it's possible to forgive, except, you know, if you know that the person is not really culpable because they were mentally, you know, they were children at the time or drunk or something. If you is mentally ill, you can say that then you can forgive somebody because they didn't know what they were doing or couldn't have controlled themselves. But unless there's real remorse and it's clear, I don't see how anybody can actually forgive.
I don't even know about forgiveness. It's about, it's really, the fundamental thing is, can we live together? I might not forgive you, but I can accept the fact that you're working at the next desk, okay? And I will not look for revenge. This is different. But for that to be possible, there needs to be some kind of symbolic universal confirmation that says we were right to want to live, they were wrong to try and kill us. And unless this exists, it can be imposed from the outside, as in Germany in 45. I mean, Germany in 45 was not a repentant society, right? It was a defeated society.
Okay, now that's a really interesting point.
No,
because I would think at some point they became a repentant society.
They did.
And I don't know how that happened.
Because first, for a generation, they had to play repentant. Otherwise, they didn't have a glimmer of a chance to be accepted as part of the civilized world again. So they played it so well that eventually became reality.
Mm.
And the same is true with German democracy. But the real test happens in 68, when their children grow up and start asking, so what did you do in the war? Everybody knew more or less what everybody else did in the war. This simply was not discussed in public because we're supposed to be repentant and Democrats. But what Germany could get away with facing its occupiers and victors, they couldn't get away with facing their children. And Germany had this extraordinary public debate in 68 and after, which profoundly transformed it as a society. And this was not play acting anymore. You can't play act when your interlocutor and your accuser is your son. And Germany genuinely transformed itself in a way that no other society which had been guilty of genocide has.
You know, I've been trying to reach somebody in Germany to interview about this, and it's not that easy for me to find somebody. You may even be able to refer me. But my thinking about a month or two ago was that Russia's going to have to go through something awful. God knows what they have to go through, but with 80% of the people saying they support the war, I don't, and probably the rest of them don't say that they don't support the war in public because of safety reasons. There's going to be a big transition when people have to acknowledge culpability and guilt. And I wanted to find out somebody who could tell me what that experience was like in Germany for the people who actually went through it. What was that emotionally like to reconsider one's own past and say, boy, was I wrong, and boy, do I have to do something to try to make up for it. And I can't find anybody who's able to talk about that. Tell me what you think.
There are people, and it was extremely gradual. You had some individuals who were able to grasp it from the onset. Karl Jaspers wrote this extraordinary essay on guilt. Where Karl Jaspers, German philosopher, passed away long since, in which he says that there are 3 levels, actually 4 levels of guilt. There is legal guilt. Somebody who committed a crime should go to jail. End of story. Then there is political guilt. Somebody who supported a regime that was going to commit crimes bears political responsibility for what happened. Then there is moral guilt. Even if you were unable to prevent a crime, to stop your neighbor from being arrested, murdered, deported, whatever, even if you could defend your case in court and be exonerated, you still bear the moral guilt of not having prevented a crime that was happening next door. And then there is metaphysical guilt, which essentially means that God does not clean up after us. That if we allow evil to triumph, even if it's defeated, the consequences remain with us. I tend to speak of it through the metaphor of pollution. We pollute the world in which our children will live. And not only physically, through carbon emissions, but also metaphysically, through our tolerance of evil. We simply give our children a world that has been harmed by our inaction. And this is, I think, a universal formula, but individuals confronted with it acted in very different ways. And it really took this generation till 68 to transform Germany so much that it could have its internal conflict, not one imposed by occupiers, but a genuine internal conflict and catharsis. And this produced the Germany, which was Europe's moral leader in terms of advocating pacifism, of supporting other countries. The Germany that was so extraordinary in 2014, 2015, during the refugee crisis, they took over 1 million people in because that was the right thing to do. But I'm speaking from Poland. We took in over 3 million people in barely 3 months. My city, Warsaw, is bursting at the seams.
I know.
Its population has grown by 17%.
You know, I have, this is sort of a sidetrack. I don't want to derail you, but I do have some confusion or something. One of my friends is a Pole I spoke to him a couple of months ago, and he was very upset that they were getting so little support, that there was no help from the West, from, I don't know, we would say the West, from North America, from Canada, from the US. There was no help. And I said, what are you talking about? This is the most drastic change in policy for Europe in general and the US to have so quickly decided to support in every way they can. So we kind of left on bad terms because he thought that I was totally stupid to not know better than what I just said. Tell me.
As usual, it's more complicated. We're living under a pretty nasty regime, which has seriously subverted the independence of the judiciary. And since we're part of the European Union, our subversion is a subversion of the European judiciary, right? So in retaliation, Brussels has blocked disbursement of funds for post-COVID recovery. And this is a known thing. This is the price the Polish government is making us pay for its pleasure of subverting our judiciary. Now,
could that be what my friend was referring to? I wasn't aware of it.
It's a very serious issue. Now a kind of rotten compromise has been struck, and there are perspectives of unblocking those funds. It's almost 40 billion euro. That's some serious money. Now, the new issue is the refugee crisis, and our government has so far refused to apply for additional funding from the European Union on grounds that the European Union is a hostile body and we don't want Poland to owe anything to Brussels. So this is an extraordinary case of ill will on the side of our government. But on top of that, just to show how unsimple the situation is, we've been living the Ukrainian refugee crisis from day one of the war, but Poland has been living a refugee crisis since last summer, where another neighboring country, Belarus, run by somebody who's called optimistically Europe's last dictator, Mr. Lukashenko. This probably means that once he dies, we'll have no more dictators, right? Since he's Europe's last. If only. But Lukashenko has started importing desperate people from the Middle East trying to get into the EU, bringing them visa-less to Belarus, and essentially escorting them over the Polish border.
Okay, now when I knew that part, but what I didn't know and still don't is, was it, say, the EU, or was it Poland that basically was saying we will keep them out, or both?
I'm trying to say that to answer your question. Poland is refusing those refugees, essentially on the grounds that they're Muslim and third world and alien civilization, and we don't want them. So Poland is practicing pushbacks. When the refugees are found in the forests on the Polish-Belarus border, they're forcibly ejected to Belarus again.
Mhm.
This is illegal. Poland has signed a number of international conventions that make it illegal to prevent somebody from applying for asylum. But even if you scream at the top of your voice, I want asylum, it doesn't help. The Polish border guards will still dump you on the other side.
Mhm.
At least 24 people have died.
Okay,
And
but
this is
you said that there's a dispute between EU and Poland on this laws about the
the dispute is
yeah.
about the general undermining of the independence of the judiciary by the government. On the treatment of refugees in Belarus, sadly, there is no dispute.
So the EU would not object to what
Well, the
Poland.
EU would not publicly condone, but this is what Greece is doing on its maritime border with Turkey. Europe is chock full of refugees, and there is understanding in Brussels for a regime, even if nasty, if it turns refugee away, unless they're white Christians, which is the lucky case of the Belarusians.
Yeah.
But even here, there is a discriminatory regime. If you are a refugee from Belarus who can prove Belarusian citizenship, you get a residence permit, you get government help, and whatever. If you're just a refugee from Ukraine, and there were about 500,000 foreigners living in Ukraine, many of them students, all you get is the right to spend 15 days on Polish territory.
Oh, even now?
Even now. Now it's no longer a problem because most everybody who wanted to flee Ukraine into Poland has already done so.
And if they got 15 days in Poland, then they could go elsewhere afterwards and
Yes.
not have to go back to Ukraine?
Well, no, but if you had to run for your life and you left everything you had, including your money, well, if you are, say, Indian or Moroccan, then you have a well-functioning embassy in Warsaw that will help you. If you're Ghanaian, so one of the things we did in this movement to help refugees was a specialized part of it to help dark-skinned refugees who couldn't count on any assistance from the state and were therefore in even more dire strait than the quote-unquote regular Ukrainian refugees, right? So I do think that Poland is owed recognition for the extraordinary work we've done with the Ukrainian refugees, especially as the majority of them found room and board in private homes.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's really what I was mindful of, is that the Poles are doing fantastic generosity. Showing.
Yes, and this is true, but this is not the entire truth.
Yeah, okay.
And those wonderful achievements should not serve as an alibi for much less, for actions much less deserving of respect.
Okay, let's go back to the thing about Germany and 68 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't remember that as a special moment. And I'm thinking, well, yes, but Germany was not the only place in the world where there was anti-Semitism. And, certainly Poland has no reason to apologize for a lot of things. But if there was, if Germans actually went through some soul searching about their anti-Semitism during the war, what did the Poles go through, if ever?
The Poles went through genocide. Of the 6 million Polish citizens murdered during the war, 3 million were Polish Jews, 3 million were non-Jewish Poles. And this creates an impossible conundrum. The Jews were murdered by the invading Germans. Without the Germans, there would not have been the genocide. But thousands of Poles participated in that genocide on an individual basis, and yet remained victims of the same Germans.
Right. Okay.
And this is an ethical trap, because we sometimes think that suffering ennobles, right? And that's a fallacy. Suffering does not ennoble. I mean, I know individuals who've gone through suffering and emerged noble, but my suspicion is they would have emerged noble anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Collectively, suffering does not ennoble. It makes you callous and indifferent to the suffering of others because you're so much concentrated on your own pain. And the Poles, having suffered horribly under the Germans, and legitimately having a sense of having been victimized, martyrized, were in no position to examine their own actions towards other people, like Jews. A victim cannot be a perpetrator, right? Wrong. A victim can be a perpetrator, but it's so much more difficult for a victim to be able to recognize that.
Okay.
And on top of that, it's not only about metaphysical guilt, to quote Jaspers once again. It is about the very concrete political consequences of being recognized as a victim. Poles feel deprived of the recognition of their suffering and see Jewish suffering recognized.
Oh my, okay.
All it takes is for a Polish kid to travel to the West and see in a bookstore bookshelf after bookshelf of books about the Shoah. And if it's a big bookstore and well-stocked, maybe he'll find something about Poland as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the mayor of Nagasaki once famously said that there's just one thing worse than being the first city to be A-bombed. That's being the second city. Everybody remembers Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. And then there was Naga something. Nobody wants to be Naga something,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, got it.
So there is a competition in suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And it is seen as a zero-sum game. If I recognize your suffering, this will diminish mine. And
you see this actually playing out in everyday life? Do you see this kind of logic behind interactions that you can observe in Poland?
Well, on a minor level, because there are not enough Jews in Poland for this to become a social issue. We're 8,000, down from 3.5 million in 1939. But on the political level, absolutely. The government is using the concept of the unrecognized Polish suffering in World War II to bludgeon everybody over the head with, especially Germany, but in general, the West, that was uncaring, insensitive, whatever, and refuses to recognize Jewish claims on the grounds of how can you accuse a victim?
Got it. Oh, that is so interesting. Oh, yes. I have never been much of a Marxist, never even tried. But, I guess I never thought of myself one way or another. But over time, I would say that Weber was right. Most of the dynamics of what really conflicts and issues in society are not really about money. It's about honor and status and humiliation and dignity and who's got more moral virtue than who doesn't, and that kind of thing. And I think that this gets lost. People, I'm still trying to figure out why we have this, not still trying to, I'm continuing and will always be baffled by this upsurge in populist right wing, craziness going on worldwide now. And because I can't, you sure can't explain it in terms of economics problems, issues. It's just not about that.
No,
But I don't get why it's going on. And all I can think of is that it has to be somehow motivated by some kind of resentment that is of the level of thing that you've just given. Because I wasn't aware of the thing you talked about, this who gets more right to be aggrieved about not being recognized as a victim. That's a very interesting dynamic. But, there are more versions of it.
That's one of the engines driving it in Central Europe. But it goes deeper. In a recent poll, 19% of the Poles agreed with the statement that although war is horrible, it is a good thing that as a result of the war, there are less Jews in Poland than there were. 19%, 1 in 5. And I would assume that over most of Central Europe, people will say that, yeah, it has been horrible, but it's a good thing that we are not multi-ethnic anymore. It's just us. It's not only Eastern Europe. Marine Le Pen came close to being the president of France, and her main slogan is "On est entre nous." We are among our own, and therefore we don't want those who are not our own, right? Now, this is happening in a time in which mass migration is not anymore a crisis, it's the new normal. The technical means for mass migration exist. You add the dengue and GPS, and mainly everybody can try getting everywhere. In previous generations, you needed passers who knew the way through the mountain valleys and whatever. Now all it takes is GPS. And not only that, but there is general knowledge that had you had the good luck of being born in Finland instead of Somalia, your life expectancy would be 80 something and not 50 something. Now, there's not much you can do about it for yourself, but your child, would you prefer your child to live 50 years or 80 years? So obviously, the people have the means and an incentive to move into places which are safe. However, the inhabitants...
Wait a minute. I wonder how far you can attribute everything that's right-wing populist to that. Certainly the US, Trump, that's true. You can say a whole lot of Trumpism was about wanting to keep Mexicans and Muslims out. But I mean, Bolsonaro or Duterte or Modi, I don't know.
I'm getting there, but I'm trying to explain what I'm trying to explain, okay?
Okay.
So what happens is that suddenly and very rapidly, your neighborhood is changing. You have people there who are of different skin color, practice a different religion, speak a different language, use different spices in their cooking, write in a different alphabet, and you no longer feel at home. Now, the right to feel at home is, I believe, a basic human right. And people who say, well, it's nothing personal, but we'd rather to be among us Swedes, us Poles, whatever, than to have to adapt to having very different neighbors. But those very different neighbors aren't here as tourists. They're here to save their lives. And therefore, the fact that they make us uncomfortable is not going to make them change their mind. And this means that we need to accept a change in our societies, and we don't want to do that. In Europe, and yes, I agree, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Modi function on a somewhat different level, although if you look at the way that Modi treats foreigners, quote unquote, including quote unquote internal foreigners, the Muslims, it's a page from the same playbook. Mm-hmm. But in Europe, where the crisis is most acute, the fundamental issue is we have to understand that we are about to lose our exclusive rights to the land where we were born. This has already happened once with the French Revolution, where the aristocrats had to finally accept that they have to share citizenship with the common folk. Mm. And it took Europe a bloody 19th century to come to terms with that, right? And eventually, when we did get universal suffrage, even including women, which would incidentally have been a surprise for the male French revolutionaries, they didn't think they're fighting to have the woman vote. The women were supposed to stay at home and cook the meals for the fighters, right? But this happened because the alternative was worse. We're again at a similar junction. If we accept that, yes, the fact that we were born here and Mehmet was not, no longer gives us absolute privilege over Mehmet. And we need to share because the alternative is worse. That will take some time and some preparation. In the meantime, leaders who say, well, let's just throw the foreigners out and let's have life the way it was, are going to get a hearing and a vote. In multicultural India, this worked for a long time. And this is why in India, it is more about religion than ethnicity. But once we establish the principle that the majority can essentially tell the minority to shut up, or better still, remove it, it's just a question of time before the Punjabis start telling those uppity Gujaratis that they should shut up and not interfere with what the legitimate owners of the countries have to say. Mm-hmm. Bolsonaro emerges from a society which is deeply divided over who is the legitimate owner of Brazil. And white and dark-skinned Brazilians are in a perpetual class struggle over this, although they by and large agree that whoever is the legitimate owner, the natives in the Amazonia are not. So it is a similar matrix of conflict. And ultimately, we do have to accept a world in which migration is not a problem that somebody should do something about, but is what human beings do.
Absolutely. Wow. Oh, this has been wonderful. It is, our time's up. And it's just absolutely the best treat to be back in touch with you and to follow your, because you've told me things today I wasn't aware of, and yet it all makes sense. So,
speaking of Germany, one book I could recommend is Learning from the Germans by Susan Neiman, published 2 or 3 years ago, in which she describes how the Germans came to terms with their genocidal past and what lessons Americans can draw from that regarding their racial issue. To be very high.
I'll read it. I'll get it. Good. Thank you. It's been wonderful. Let's not wait another 25 years to be back in touch. I'd
be delighted. And if you're ever in my neck of the woods,
okay.
give me a call.
All right. So we do have more things, ways in which catching up still is incomplete. So I hope to be able to do it. So thank you so much, Constantine.
Take care. Good talking to you.
Yes. Bye. This is episode number 465. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, which is tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post transcripts there. And when you get there, look around. We have conversations there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.